This is a dramatized retelling inspired by real-world themes. Some details and characters are fictionalized. Morgan Freeman stopped the entire production with 6 words that nobody expected. What happened next, under a canvas tent on a dusty Louisiana backlot, would change the lives of 12 young extras and silence a man who thought he knew everything about courage. It was March 14, 2003, somewhere outside Baton Rouge, Louisiana. The temperature had already climbed past 90 degrees by 10 in the morning, and the air was thick with humidity and the smell of diesel from the generators powering the massive production lights. This was the set of a major war film, one of those sprawling historical epics that required hundreds of extras, period-accurate uniforms, and the kind of budget that made studio executives nervous. Morgan Freeman was there in a supporting role, playing a commanding officer whose quiet authority would anchor some of the film's most emotional scenes. 65 years old, he had already won his share of accolades and earned a reputation not just for his talent, but for something harder to define: a presence, a gravity, the kind of energy that made people listen when he spoke, even when his voice was barely above a whisper. The production had hired a military advisor named Frank Hollister. Frank was 52 years old, barrel-chested, with a crew cut that looked like it had been maintained every 2 weeks since 1975. He wore his credentials like armor: 23 years in the Army, 2 tours in combat zones, a chest full of ribbons, and a voice that could cut through any conversation. His job was to make sure the actors held their rifles correctly, moved in formation, and understood the weight of what they were pretending to experience. Frank was good at his job. Nobody disputed that. But Frank also had a habit of making sure everyone knew exactly how good he was and exactly how much more he had seen than anyone else on set. On this particular morning, the production was setting up for a complicated scene involving a troop movement through a bombed-out village. The main actors were in their trailers, running lines and staying cool. But out on the set, about 30 extras in sweat-soaked military uniforms were waiting under the brutal sun for the crew to finish adjusting the lighting. 12 of those extras were young, really young. Most of them were between 18 and 22, local kids who had shown up to casting calls hoping for a SAG voucher and maybe a story to tell. Some were film students from LSU. Others were just kids who needed the $150 a day and thought being in a movie sounded better than their summer jobs at grocery stores and gas stations. They were gathered near a row of sandbags, trying to find shade wherever they could, when Frank Hollister walked over. He had a clipboard in one hand and a water bottle in the other, and he was already shaking his head before he'd reached them. "Look at you," Frank said, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Slumped over like a bunch of wet noodles. You think soldiers stand around like that? You think men who've actually been in combat let themselves go soft because it's a little warm outside?" The young extras straightened up, uncertain whether this was a real criticism or just the advisor doing his job. A few of them mumbled apologies. One kid, a skinny 20-year-old named Derek with acne scars and nervous eyes, actually said "yes, sir" out of pure reflex. Frank laughed. Not a kind laugh. The kind of laugh that tells you the person making it enjoys having power over you. "You want to know about fear?" Frank continued, settling into what was clearly a familiar rhythm. "Real fear? I've seen men freeze up so bad they couldn't pull a trigger. I've seen grown men cry like babies because they heard a loud noise. That's what happens when you don't train yourself to be hard, when you don't learn how real men handle fear." He paused, looking at the young faces around him. "You kids wouldn't last 5 minutes in a real combat situation. You'd be the ones hiding behind a wall, praying for mommy, while actual soldiers did the work." Nobody said anything. What could they say? Frank had the authority here. Frank had the experience. Frank had the stories that none of them could match. And besides, they were just extras. They were lucky to be here at all. Derek, the nervous kid, looked down at the ground. His hands were shaking slightly, though whether from the heat or the humiliation was hard to tell. A young woman named Keisha, 21, a film student who had written her thesis on war cinema, bit her lip hard enough to leave a mark. That's when Morgan Freeman walked over. Nobody had noticed him approaching. He had been on his way from his trailer to the makeup tent, wearing khaki pants and a loose white shirt, script pages rolled up in his back pocket. But he had stopped when he heard Frank's voice carrying across the set, had stood there, just out of sight, listening to the whole speech. Now he stepped into the circle of young extras like he belonged there, like he had always been part of the conversation. "Frank," Morgan said, his voice calm and measured, "can I borrow these young people for a few minutes?" Frank looked surprised, annoyed. This wasn't protocol. The extras were supposed to stay where they could be called for the next setup. "Mr. Freeman, we're in the middle of—" "I know," Morgan said. "I'll have them back before the first team is ready. I just need a few minutes." There was something in his tone that made it clear this wasn't a request. Frank's jaw tightened, but he nodded. What else could he do? This was Morgan Freeman. You didn't say no to Morgan Freeman. "Come with me," Morgan said to the young extras. "All of you. There's a tent over by the craft services truck with some shade and some cold water. Let's get out of this sun for a minute." The 12 young people followed him without hesitation. Derek was still shaking. Keisha kept glancing back at Frank, who was watching them go with an expression that was hard to read. The tent Morgan had mentioned was really more of a large canopy, set up to provide shade for the crew during breaks. Right now it was empty except for some folding chairs and a cooler full of water bottles. Morgan gestured for everyone to sit, then grabbed waters from the cooler and handed them out himself. For a moment, nobody spoke. The young extras sipped their water and waited, unsure why they were here, unsure what was expected of them. Morgan pulled up a chair and sat down facing them. He didn't look like a movie star in that moment. He looked like someone's grandfather, someone who had something to say and all the time in the world to say it. "I heard what Frank said back there," Morgan began, "about fear, about real men, about what you kids wouldn't be able to handle." A few of them shifted, uncomfortably. Derek looked like he wanted to disappear into the ground. "I want to tell you something," Morgan continued. "A story. Something I don't talk about very often. And I want you to listen because I think it might be useful." He leaned back in his chair, his eyes going somewhere distant for a moment. "When I was young, younger than most of you, I joined the Air Force, 1955. I was 18 years old, and I thought I knew exactly who I was and what I wanted. I was going to be a fighter pilot. I was going to be brave and strong and everything a man was supposed to be. I had watched all the movies. I had read all the books. I knew what courage looked like." He paused, letting the silence build. "And then I got there, to basic training, and I discovered something that nobody had told me about. I discovered that I was afraid." The word hung in the air. Afraid. Coming from Morgan Freeman, who seemed like the least afraid person any of them had ever encountered. "Not afraid of the planes," he continued. "Not afraid of the training or the discipline or any of that. I was afraid of being found out, afraid that everyone would realize I didn't belong there, that I wasn't as strong or as brave or as certain as I was pretending to be." Derek looked up for the first time, something shifting in his eyes. "There was this drill sergeant," Morgan said. "Big man, loud voice, very much like Frank, actually. He had a way of looking at you that made you feel about 2 inches tall. And one day, about 3 weeks into basic, he called me out in front of everyone, said I was soft, said I was going to wash out, said I didn't have what it took to be a real airman." Morgan smiled slightly, but there was no humor in it. "And you know what? He was right about some of it. I was soft in some ways. I was struggling. I was having doubts every single day about whether I had made the right choice. But here's what he didn't know, what he couldn't see because he wasn't looking." He leaned forward, his voice dropping lower, pulling them all in closer. "I was also the guy who stayed up until 2 in the morning helping another recruit who couldn't read very well study for his written exams. I was the guy who gave my dessert to a kid who was homesick and couldn't eat because his stomach was in knots. I was the guy who wrote letters home for men who were too embarrassed to admit they didn't know how to spell." He looked at each of the young extras in turn, making eye contact, making sure they were listening. That drill sergeant saw one version of strength, the loud version, the version that puffs up its chest and talks about what it can handle. But there's another kind of strength, the quiet kind, the kind that shows up when nobody's watching, the kind that admits it's afraid and does the thing anyway. Keisha wiped her eyes. She hadn't realized she was crying. "I want to tell you something else," Morgan said. "Something I learned later after I left the Air Force and Started trying to become an actor. You know how long it took me to get my first real break in this business? They shook their heads. Years. Many years. I worked as a dancer at the 1964 World's Fair. I worked in off-Broadway plays that closed after a week. I was in my 50s before most of the world knew my name. 50s. And the whole time, there were people telling me I wasn't enough, wasn't talented enough, wasn't young enough, wasn't the right type, wasn't willing to play the game the way they wanted me to play it. He spread his hands. And you know what I learned? I learned that the people who talk the loudest about what real strength looks like are usually the ones who understand it the least. Because real strength isn't about never being afraid. Real strength is about being terrified and still choosing to show up, still choosing to be kind, still choosing to help the person next to you even when you're barely keeping yourself together. Derek's hands had stopped shaking. He was sitting up straighter now, looking at Morgan with an intensity that hadn't been there before. "That man out there," Morgan said, gesturing vaguely toward where Frank was waiting, "he's seen things none of us can imagine. That's true. And I respect what he's been through. But he's also missing something important. He's forgotten what it was like to be young and uncertain. He's forgotten that the bravest thing most people ever do isn't charging into battle. It's getting up in the morning when everything feels impossible. It's asking for help when you're drowning. It's admitting you don't have all the answers." He stood up, signaling that the moment was coming to an end. "You're all here because you want to be part of something. You want to make something. You want to tell stories that matter. That takes courage. Different from the courage Frank talks about, but just as real. Maybe more real, because nobody's going to give you a medal for it. Nobody's going to... Thank you for showing up to a set in 90-degree heat and standing around in wool uniforms for 12 hours a day just so someone else can shoot a scene." He looked at Derek specifically. "Don't let anyone make you feel small because you're afraid. Fear is information. It tells you that you're paying attention. It tells you that something matters to you. The trick isn't to get rid of it. The trick is to let it sit beside you instead of in front of you." Morgan turned and started walking back toward the set. The 12 young extras followed, but something had shifted in how they carried themselves. Their shoulders were straighter. Their eyes were clearer. When they reached the area where Frank was waiting, Morgan walked directly over to him. The crew members nearby stopped what they were doing, sensing that something was about to happen. "Frank," Morgan said, his voice still calm, still quiet, but carrying enough weight to silence everyone within earshot. "These young people are here because they believe in what we're making. They deserve the same respect you'd give any soldier in your unit, maybe more, because they're volunteers." Frank opened his mouth to respond, but Morgan wasn't finished. "I know you've seen things none of us have seen. I know you've earned every ribbon on your chest. But there's more than one way to be brave, and there's more than one way to teach people about it. These kids don't need to be broken down. They need to be built up. That's what good leaders do." For a long moment, Frank just stared at him. His face went through several expressions, none of them comfortable. Anger, defensiveness, embarrassment, and finally, somewhere underneath all of that, something that looked almost like recognition. He didn't apologize, not out loud, but he nodded once, sharp and short, and when he turned back to the extras, his voice was different. Still gruff, still demanding, but without the cruelty. The rest of that day, and the days that followed, the set felt different. The young extras moved with more confidence. They asked questions without fear of ridicule. They helped each other through the long, grueling hours of filming. And Frank Hollister, the military advisor who thought he knew everything about courage, was seen after wrap one evening sitting under that same tent, alone, staring at the ground. Nobody knows exactly what he was thinking about, but one of the assistant directors noticed that he seemed quieter after that day, less prone to lecture, more willing to listen. Derek, the nervous kid with the shaking hands, finished the shoot and went back to LSU. 2 years later, he graduated with a degree in film production and got a job as a production assistant on a small independent film. He kept a notebook on every set he worked, and on the first page, he had written something Morgan Freeman told him that day under the tent. "Fear is information. Let it sit beside you, not in front of you." Keisha finished her thesis and submitted it to a documentary film festival. It didn't win, but it got noticed, And that notice led to an internship, which led to a job, which led to a career. 20 years later, she would be nominated for an Academy Award for a documentary about veterans returning home from war, a film that treated its subjects with exactly the kind of quiet respect that Morgan had shown those young extras on that hot Louisiana day. Morgan Freeman never talked publicly about what happened under that tent. For him, it was just one of thousands of small moments in a long career. He probably didn't even remember most of the details. But the people who were there remembered. They remembered that a man who could have spent his break in an air-conditioned trailer instead chose to walk into the heat and share a piece of himself with strangers. They remembered that he didn't lecture or preach, just told a story and let them find their own meaning in it. They remembered that he treated them like they mattered, because they did. That's what a legacy really is. Not the awards or the famous roles or the voice that narrates our collective dreams. A legacy is the sum of all the small choices a person makes when nobody's watching. The moments of kindness that never make the headlines. The quiet acts of courage that change one life at a time. Morgan Freeman stopped a war film set because he saw young people being made to feel small. What happened next didn't make the newspapers. It didn't trend on social media. It was just a story told under a tent, a lesson shared between strangers, a moment of human connection in a business that often forgets to be human. But for 12 young extras on a dusty Louisiana backlot, it was everything. And maybe that's the most important story of all. If this story moved you, take a moment to subscribe and share it with someone who might need to hear it today. Have you ever had someone show you unexpected kindness when you needed it most? Tell us about it in the comments. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to read.